I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respect to elders past and present. I recognize their enduring connection to land, water, and community, and recognize their sovereignty which stands seated. So by the time this video ends, about 4 women globally will be killed by an intimate partner. And globally, 1 in 4 children under 5 live with a mother who has experienced family violence. And in between 2023 and 2024, in Australia alone, 46 women were killed by an intimate partner. And now of those who are more likely to be hospitalised due to family violence, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 30 times more likely to experience this. Now, we live in a world where our news feeds are inundated with news of geopolitical conflict, and the UN reports that conflict-related sexual violence has increased by 50%. And in a world where the digital landscape is ever evolving, we know that technology is often weaponized against women, with 58% of women globally and 53% of women in Australia having experienced this online. I'm Maria Fatil. I am an actor, an advocate, and an author, and I am here today with United Nations Women Australia because safety is a right, it is not a privilege. And I know that in my career, I have spoken a lot about what it is like to be a woman of colour, a daughter of Indian immigrants, a queer woman, and I do it because when we speak about the women and children in the statistics that I mentioned earlier, they end up becoming regrettable numbers who are sadly casualties in a broken system. And these regrettable numbers, they just swell and they crest and they get bigger when we resign ourselves to a fact that this is an inescapable reality. But do you know what? It isn't. It isn't when we work together as an ecosystem, because when we do, we have a fighting chance of actually making sure that women and children are safe everywhere, always. And joining me today is an esteemed panel of leaders who are so impactful in their respective fields. We have Chawla, Conor Pall, and Professor Heather Douglas. And today we're going to be talking about intersectional solutions and practical actions for change. Welcome. So I want to start with someone who is at the forefront of engaging men in this conversation. This is someone I'm very privileged to call a friend, but is also an award-winning advocate, a writer, and a commissioner for the Victorian Multicultural Commission. Tarang Chawla co-founded Not One More Nikki in memory of his sister. And he brings powerful survivor-centered advocacy to the forefront of these conversations. Tarang, welcome.
Thank you.
When we talk about ending men's violence against women and children, what cultural barriers continue to hamper male engagement in this cause?
I think there are a lot of barriers that get in the way. Chief among them, probably, Maria, is that men's silence is often rewarded. Men's silence in terms of speaking out against sexist language, sexist banter, things that are considered just jokes and what we might call locker room talk. I think that in Australia, but also around the world, we have this culture that rewards men's relationships with other men, where there's tacit approval for things that might dehumanize women or might be seen as being misogynistic or sexist. And I think in terms of barriers, that's something that gets in the way. We have this culture where men are almost rewarded for not speaking up, because men who do speak up are often ostracized from the group. They're often kicked out of the group, or they're avoided altogether. And I think that we have to change that. We have to overcome this idea that the men who speak out are the problem, and actually look at men's silence as complicity, and look at men's silence as allowing the conditions for violence to flourish. We actually have to change that cultural landscape. Firstly, when it comes to addressing that notion of not all men being violent, we know that, right? It's I don't know anyone that is daft enough to think that all men are violent. Yeah. That's not the case. No. But when we speak about women's experiences and children's experiences of violence at the hands of men, and when I say violence, I include in that, non-physical forms of violence, yes, and abuse as well, and tech-facilitated abuse as well. But when we talk about that, what we have to recognize is that these conversations might have been had by women and survivors and advocates for a long time, but they're actually quite new to men. And so I think, in my work with engaging boys and men, I always hold space for that defensiveness, right? And I allow space for that, but not complicity. And what I mean by that is that it's okay to recognize the experiences of an individual boy or man being difficult, because the patriarchy and systems of oppression also impact on them. But at the same time, we can't allow that to be tacit approval for the systemic oppressors against women and children and trans and gender diverse folk. So we have to be able to recognize that two things are true here. Yeah. On the one hand, the individual experience of being a boy or man can be really difficult, be really challenging, but boys and men aren't systemically oppressed, and they haven't been for generations, particularly in the West. And so what we need to see in order to shift that culture is more examples of male leadership. It shouldn't rely on, for example, people like Conor who've grown up in abusive environments where they then choose to speak out, right? Because survivors don't owe anyone their story, their experiences, their trauma. It shouldn't be on family members of murder victims, such as myself or other people in my family, like my mum, who speaks out. It should be the examples of people who consider themselves good men in society. Your sports people, your community leaders, your politicians, right? We live in a culture where politicians are so, particularly male politicians, are so reticent to speak out about men's violence against women, or they'll do the thing that so many women find utterly cringeworthy, which is they'll put a ribbon on for one day, they'll attend a morning tea organised by women, and then they'll just leave before the keynote speaker, who's a survivor, sharing their experiences. And I think to change that culture, we need to see more men taking positions of leadership and taking a stand.
And just, if we're going to talk about a powerful example of male leadership, like, this is it. People like you both, this is it, and this is what it looks like. And when you say things like, you hold space for that defensiveness, I love that, because one thing that I personally feel, this is my personal opinion, I guess, it's when we're looking at change and we're trying to change cultural narratives, whether it's around sexism or homophobia or whatever it is, it's so important to recognize that you also need to take stock of where we're at and hold space, meet people where they're at, but also don't accept tacit complicity. Don't accept people just, well, this is where I'm at and this is how it is. You can acknowledge, and two things can be true, that yes, I understand why you're feeling this way, but let's unpack that and hold space for those conversations, because what we're talking about here, men's violence against women and children, it actually does affect the good men who are silent and don't necessarily exhibit those overt forms of violence, but it affects them too.
Yeah. Because I think, as you sort of suggested, it's stigmatizing sometimes to speak up, and people are fearful of speaking up. What will happen to me? Will I be excluded? And all of that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to give people strategies that are simple and not brutal or vicious or kind of rough or whatever it might be concerning them. Just sort of quiet interventions that make them able to exercise that possibility of saying, well, this is really bad, that behaviour of my friend is making me feel uncomfortable, but how do I best intervene?
Yeah.
We've got a really good example at the law school where I work, where the students are running this program for sexual misconduct, where they get all the students together and basically give them training around what sexual assault is. People are able to share their experiences. They give them examples of ways to intervene. They do role plays. And I think a lot of our institutions have responsibilities to set up those opportunities to learn how to do that.
I love hearing that, because I studied at a law school and I wish that we had that when I was there.
Yes.
Because the thing about it that strikes me, particularly in that environment like a law school, is that these are people we're training to be future generations of lawyers who know, legally right from wrong, and yet examples of sexual assault are happening, and seemingly, some of the brightest and boldest minds of a generation are engaging in this behaviour, not even aware that what they're doing is having irreparable consequences, primarily in the lives of women around them. And I just think it's so important to have that education piece to be able to support, and also at an age where there is the ability to retrain and to learn what is right from wrong and educate others. And I think that's why Conor, for me, is such a powerful example as a young person speaking out, because you're resonating with people that I could only dream of resonating with.
And I wonder, the conversations we have with men and boys and all people in our community around family violence and men's use of violence, I think we need to start thinking about those conversations as opportunities to intervene early,
I agree.
not just
Yes.
with people who might be using violence,
Yep.
but also people who might be experiencing it. And I think
Yep.
so often we talk about prevention and we forget that it should be an intended consequence of these conversations that we're
Yes.
having
Yeah.
for people to disclose their use of violence or their experience of violence. And
Yeah.
I think it's on all of us to make sure that if someone does disclose, that they're believed and that they're met with a system of supports that sees them as a person.
I don't think we should be separating out those ideas of prevention and response. I mean, I think it's all mixed up together,
Yeah,
really. All
for sure.
responses are an opportunity for future prevention, I think. So we really need to kind of think of those things together.
It's not just you watching at home. It's not just me in the work I do, or Connor, Tarang, and Heather. It's people who work in the legal field, who work in education, who are in schools. Because you're right, Tarang, when you said that we need to be changing these ideas from a very early age. Because I think what happens, and then I'll ask you this next question, it's a nice segue. But when you mentioned that, I was just thinking about, you said so many people don't even realize, some of the brightest and boldest minds don't realize they're engaging in this behavior. Because you see these experiences, and often in elite schools, or like I've had experience with that and have spoken out about that sort of thing. And it's like, sometimes we are raising boys in a world where, one, their complicity is rewarded, but unfortunately, that privilege is really hard to speak up against. And so I know you sort of lightly touched on it, but I guess then I want to ask, for the men now and boys who do want to step up, what are some really actionable items that can help them go from awareness of this conversation to then actual intervention?
Such a great question. Honestly, such a great question, and such a timely question, because there is that gap between awareness and action, especially for men. And I think when it comes to awareness, most men are aware, hopefully, most men are aware about violence and abuse being wrong. But a lot of men aren't sure what to do, right? So for example, they're not sure what to do if they witness it, and they're certainly not sure what to do if they are concerned about their potential use of it. And I think one of the things that's so important that men can do in the group settings that they find themselves in is to start calling others in. So rather than calling out harmful behaviour and using it as a way to diminish the size of the group and ostracize, start expecting better. So for example, if someone makes a sexist joke or remark in the group chat, instead of jumping down the other person's throat and saying, oh, you know, Tyler or whatever their name is always making these, you know, horrendous off-colour jokes. Start expecting better. You know, things like, hey guys, come on, aren't we better than that? Like, what's the group standard that we hold ourselves to? And I think it's really powerful. We see that in sporting club settings, community settings, where we create some actual sort of ground rules of what is respect. And so then we can actually start creating this idea that women, children, everybody is safe everywhere, always, because we have these sorts of rules that we follow and that we use to guide us. And we acknowledge that in an environment, in a culture that's patriarchal, where men are rewarded for sexist behaviour, or at least they're not questioned about it, and certainly they don't face any legal consequences, that we are actually emboldening positive change. So rather than using shame as a driver to change men's behaviour, we use positive reinforcing language, that we are better than this and we expect better, right? And consequences follow when you don't hold yourself to that standard, rather than shaming men as all being bad or all being negative, because men aren't inherently bad or negative. And that's one of the things I really struggle with when it comes to this conversation, is that it becomes this zero-sum game. You know, that women somehow think that all men are bad. I don't think that's true, right? But all men do benefit from the behaviour of a select few. And that select few is unfortunately far too big. You know, if we talk about 1 in 3 women and girls experiencing violence somewhere in the world, right? That's, you know, more than 1 billion people, okay? And it's not just a handful of so-called bad apples that are doing this. There are enough men who are engaging in this type of behaviour. And so we have to rewire what it means to be a healthy, positive man in contemporary society.
Getting angry and only maybe appealing to an echo chamber or people who already see your point of view, that's not where the change lies. It's in the ability, and that it's such a powerful thing that you're able to do, even with your lived experience, to be able to say, actually, there are things that I can do and how I communicate to inspire and galvanize change instead of scaring people into it and threatening people into it.
Well, it doesn't work.
It doesn't.
It's not. It might have a very short-term positive uptick.
Yeah.
But we want long-term change.
Yes.
Because for the lives of women and children, we need long-term change.
Yes.
For them to realize their full potential, we can't just have this short-term shaming men.
No.
It doesn't work.
No.
And I think of the UN's day in October, on the 11th of October for, the girl child and just all the potential for girls in the future. If we just use shame as a driver in young boys, it's not going to help, right? We need them to be there, 50 years from now as champions, as advocates for gender equality.
Proud champions and advocates.
Exactly.
Absolutely. To that point, around encouraging people from a young age to become fierce champions and knowing what they stand for, and also the language around communicating in a positive way, not using shame as a driver. Someone who does see opportunities in this space and spoke in that way, and I thought it was so beautifully articulated, is Conor Pall. So Conor has been such a fierce champion for children and for young people who are victim survivors in their own right. And you're an advocate and an author, and you do draw on your own lived experiences to drive policy reform and to champion ethical youth participation as well. And so you've written a book, The Shadow That Follows, which is so powerful because you give children language to be able to speak about their experience of family violence. It's incredible. And you should seriously, that's legacy, right?
Thank you.
And so I guess what I want to start with, I want to ask you a million things, but where I'll start is, what has your journey taught you about the needs of children and young people who are often forgotten in this conversation? What has your journey taught you about their needs and those who are family violence survivors?
I think I've learned a lot in my sort of past 3 years of advocating. I'm now 22, and I guess I grew up in a home that was plagued by family violence, like too many children and young people, too many people in this country. And I've decided to use that experience to make sure that children and young people and all victim survivors are met with belief and support if they do experience family violence, and courageously ask for help. But I think one thing that I've learnt is that far too often children and young people are made invisible and forgotten about.
Yeah.
When we're talking about violence against women and children. They're often added as footnotes to their mother's experience, which I guess in my experiences of family violence were very different to my mum's experiences. And that's a common story for children and young people. We have a national plan to end violence against women and children. And children and young people are positioned as agents of generational change in that plan, which I think is meant to be a sort of empowering, aspirational statement. But as a young person who engages with children and young people often, that statement and that expectation is actually quite burdening when we just don't have the services and systems that are available across the country for children and young people to get support to be safe everywhere. Safety should be a starting point. And for too many women and children, it isn't. It's a privilege. And I think we have a long way to go to make sure that any child or young person who might be feeling unsafe at home knows that they have a right to be safe and free. And that's why I wrote my children's book. That's why I do this work. Because growing up, I thought the violence I was experiencing was normal. Too many children, too many women think that violence is normal. And it isn't. Rights are inherently held. The right to live a safe and free life is held by everyone. And for far too many, that right is a privilege. So I think one thing I've learnt is that we need to do a whole lot more than pitching children and young people as prevention tools and our hope to end violence in a generation, because we can't burden children and young people with that responsibility alone. And we need to be supporting children and young people to heal and recover from their experiences. And right now across our country, wait lists for counselling supports alone for children and young people are in excess of 6, 7, 8, 9 months. You know, I was in the east of Melbourne just the other week, and they have wait lists of upwards of 9 months for therapeutic counselling. And yet we have a national plan that says that children and young people need to be our hope for a violence-free future. We need to be doing more to make sure that they can heal from the experiences they've had that weren't their fault.
It's just the way you speak about it, like that. I think what is really disappointing is, that's right, we have these national plans and we have these people in positions of power who sit there every time we have federal elections, we have state level elections, whatever it is, and they will sign off on, yep, this is what we'll do and this is what, that's that or whatever. Put your money where your mouth is. We need resources. You cannot, like you said, burden young people with this, and then you tell them they have 10 months before they can access what should be a fundamental human right when they are experiencing something that they shouldn't. That is so powerful. And so then I think that's where I keep coming back to the ecosystem, because our voices matter. And we cannot leave it up to just people in positions of power. It does take advocacy from every single person and every single industry to say this is not good enough and we deserve better. But how lucky are we to have you at 22 to be doing the work that you are doing and to speak with the power and the soul and the spirit? Like, Conor, your impact is felt and we're very lucky to have that. So that really just made me cry.
I think you raised something so important, Conor, for me, around the way that older generations, particularly those who are older generations in positions of power, I'm avoiding saying the word boomer, really, but basically, the way that hope and positive change over generations is so paternalistic in its messaging, because we have to acknowledge, as you said so eloquently, Maria, the intersectional drivers and the ecosystem around men's violence against women and children. That in an environment where, particularly in Australia, we have such widespread harms from not just gender inequality, but alcohol, other drugs, gambling. I'm a sports nut, right? And every ad in the rain delays during cricket is betting. You can bet on any combination of, any kind of thing, right? And the ads are intoxicating, right? I've never gambled, right? And I'm like, maybe I should get the app. Right, that's how maybe I just don't want, maybe I just want to see some sport and I don't want any more delays. But I'm kind of like watching it, and then the warning that comes after is just this warning that is like, just a footnote, and it's just a black screen with white text, and it's like boring. Whereas the other ad is so cool and it gets you engrossed, and it's on your phone. It's right there. Like, you can just pull out your phone, get the app. 5 minutes later, you're just playing with what looks like numbers on a screen, right? But in those environments, we know that men's use of violence spikes. In environments where there's alcohol delivery services, violence spikes, right? Around major sporting events, around major holiday periods. That's the time of year that my sister Nikki was killed, the holiday period, right? What should be a safe time in the home for everybody, especially women and children, it isn't. And so what you said there is so powerful to me, because it's this paternalistic thing where it's just like, kids, the young generation, they're our hope for a better future. But if we don't embolden them with solutions that actually work, right, that actually decrease inequality, right? We don't think of things like housing inequality and family violence being linked, but homelessness is one of the biggest risk factors for women in abusive relationships. Because it's like, why didn't she leave? Okay, well, where will she go? Where will she actually go? And so we have to actually have these wraparound solutions that don't put things in silos, but empower organizations who work all over the world and, across sectors to be funded to do the work that will save lives.
Totally. And in that context, women's refuges, they're called women's refuges, they're called women's shelters. I mean, there's not enough of them. But the majority of people in women's shelters are actually children. And so now that there's such a crisis of homelessness, women are often in refuge for 3, 4, 5 months. So the kids are in refuge for that long as well. I mean, that's terrible, but it's also an opportunity to make sure kids are getting access to the services they need, whether they be health services, education services, whatever they are. So I think the ecosystem point is just so important, because women will often take their kids to court, to a health service, to women's refuge, and all of those services have to be able to manage kids. And right now, often they don't.
They can't.
And an ecosystem of support, particularly for children and young people who are help-seeking unaccompanied. There isn't an ecosystem for unaccompanied children and young people. So often they're pushed into youth homelessness refuges that aren't equipped to manage high risk family violence risk. So there are actually parts of the system we have to start building for children and young people who are victim survivors in a way that we need a system that is representative and available to the diversity of victim survivor experience, which includes children and young people. And federally, we don't even count children and young people who are murdered because of family violence. We don't even count the children who are murdered federally. So how can they be a priority for our federal government? Did anyone hear about family violence on the federal election agenda this year?
No.
No.
I didn't.
And it's like one of our biggest epidemics in this country. And and I think this is such an important point for anyone who's watching this, and maybe you're not, you don't feel like we were talking about being skilled to participate in these conversations. It is so okay if you don't feel like you are. It is so okay if this is something you're new to and you're watching this and you don't know how you're ever going to bring this conversation up with anyone. You just want to at least listen. The point we want to make is the ecosystem and the holistic nature of all of this is, if there's one thing you take away from it, it's that everything is connected and it takes all of us. Because even when, Tarang, you were talking about, for example, the sports conversation and how you wouldn't even realize when you're watching the TV and you're watching the cricket or the footy and a gambling ad comes up. So many people wouldn't even be cognizant of the fact that that is connected to being a dangerous time for these communities. And so it is holistic, it is an ecosystem, and that burden of responsibility should absolutely not be falling on people like you, Conor. It should be on all of us to support those who are experiencing something they shouldn't.
On one hand, we have governments and adults burdening children and young people to break cycles of violence and be our hope for a future free from violence. But on the other hand, then they think children and young people are too vulnerable or not articulate enough to be invited to conversations about family violence.
Which is the invisibility thing that you said. It's like, not only do we not count your voice, but we don't even see you as someone who is, affected by this.
As victims in our own right, because we have our own unique experiences of family violence. So I think whenever adults are stepping into a room, to check themselves and sort of think, well, am I talking on behalf of children and young people right now? Or how could we talk with children and young people? I think another thing that I'd say is the amount of reports and research and evidence that has been gathered, particularly in the past 2 to 3 years, about children and young people's experiences of family violence is astronomical. We don't have a knowledge problem. We know that children and young people are experiencing family violence at high rates, that their experiences are unique, and that our responses aren't up to match, that they're not serving the diversity of victim survivor experience. But the government continues to commission reports to hear from more children and young people and mine their trauma, not their expertise about what needs to change. So I think we need to look at what children and young people have already told us about what they need and actually partner with children and young people to see that that is put into action. I think often we mine children and young people's trauma, victim survivors' trauma, and then go and do the thing without them. It's that, that common expression, nothing about us without us. How can we partner with children and young people to make sure that they get the support they deserve for something that was never their fault and isn't their burden to carry alone?
And that's the only way that I think when we talk about representation, you cannot cater to communities that you're meant to serve if they don't have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And I think even though it seems like two competing things, there's a balance. The burden should not solely fall on them, but they should be included. And that feeds really nicely into conversations around systemic reform. And so Heather, your work is incredible and impactful and so valuable. You know, I'm so delighted, everyone, to introduce Professor Heather Douglas. She's from Melbourne Law School, and she's a leading expert on domestic and family violence. Now, you also specialize in criminal law and justice reform, and you lead the National Domestic and Family Violence Benchbook. So your research on non-fatal strangulation, on reproductive coercion, and on trauma-informed responses is actually shaping policy in this country. So Heather, trauma-informed responses, they are critical to reshaping survivors' experiences of the justice system. So what do we need to change to actually ensure that all survivors are properly supported and we have the right resources in place?
So much. I mean, I'm thinking about Connor's points about children and children's voices, and I think a debate that's going on now is in the family courts, for example, and most of the matters that are litigated in the family courts are around children and involve family violence. And kids really don't get to say their piece in that context, or not properly. So I think that's one place where we really need to address that issue. If you think about the journey of a person through the criminal justice process who wants to report something that's happened to them, family violence, sexual violence, going to the police station, maybe they've never been there, that can be really traumatic and intimidating. You've probably got a really young police officer with not very much training. Then they're off to the court and they're waiting around in a waiting room in a court with a whole bunch of strangers that they've never seen before. Going into court, which is a really hierarchical space. Maybe they have a lawyer, maybe they don't. If they do have a lawyer, their lawyer probably hasn't been trained in trauma-informed responses, or even in family violence or sexual violence. And then they're before a court. They may have to see the perpetrator right there in the court. There's certainly no childcare available, so you've got to figure out what to do with that. And some people bring their kids to court and get in trouble for doing that. And so there's all of those issues. They have to see their perpetrator. They have to be cross-examined about their own experience when what they really need is to be validated about their experience. So the whole court really is trauma. There are efforts being made, though, to address all of these things, and some of them are possible. So better training for police, specialised police officers to take complaints, for example, about these issues, safe waiting spaces and safe entry points for victim survivors into courts, opportunities for people to give evidence online through CCTV, opportunities to have support people with you. All of these things are in progress in some places, some of the time, but it's so inconsistent and, as you pointed out, so under-resourced. The resource issues are a really big problem, I think. So I think if we were going to invent a system that is re-traumatising, we would invent a criminal court, and other researchers have pointed to that as well. So we can address all of these parts, but even then it's still going to be a pretty tough experience, a pretty intimidating experience. So I think there really needs to be more effort put into alternatives for people as well. Things like restorative justice are also very under-resourced, and sometimes those processes are what people want and can work for people, but we really don't have very good access to those, and certainly not for kids really. So I think there's a lot of those systemic things we need to do. But I also think we also need to think not just about individual change. We really need to think about corporate responsibility in this space too.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot going on in our society, gambling, alcohol, pornography, all of these kinds of things, where we really need to be thinking, and I think we're talking about this a lot more now, how do we regulate, or how do corporations step up and do the right thing? So codes of ethics and those kinds of things. Maybe penalties for doing the wrong thing and so on. So I think that's a space we really need to be looking to as well.
Well, you brought up something interesting, because I think it also talks, I think that speaks to the evolving nature of abuse as well through different industries. And so to tie into your work, particularly with the rise of, I think, digital violence and pornography, how should legal and support systems then better respond to evolving forms of gender-based violence? Because it feels like, like you've got these systems that are re-traumatizing. And then on top of that, there is so much changing in the digital landscape, in the corporate landscape, So not only are we not keeping up with those changes to better support survivors and victims, but we're also re-traumatizing them with the systems that we have. So how can legal systems reform to keep up with that evolution?
Look, it's really complex, and I don't even know if it's possible, really. I mean, one of the things that I've been researching on is young people's engagement with sexual strangulation, which has really been pushed by the porn sites as a sort of safe practice. And we found that, you know, close to half of young people were involved in this practice and thinking that it's okay and that the consent will protect them. And it's really, most of them also said that they got this information online from sites like pornography sites and so on. So I think we really need to be able to skill up people with information. So it's not all about law. Certainly about making sure people are informed about these issues and the kinds of risks associated with them. Criminal law can do some things. It can create offences that target individuals. But as Tarang said before, you know, that's not really long-term community change that we want to see. So I think it's changing corporate attitudes is really important. And I think we're really lucky with this emerging notion around tech-facilitated abuse, things like Notify apps and, you know, AI introducing onto sort of all sorts of ways that that's impacting on digital abuse. And we've got the E-Safety Commission in Australia, which is fantastic, and they're having a lot of success with taking down images when people complain. It's very sort of reactive, but, you know, it's good that that's happening. They're also working with tech companies to try to get tech companies to manage the space as well, and they've actually had some success as well with not allowing certain apps to be available on their sites and so on their platforms. So those kinds of sort of cultural negotiations with tech companies are having some success as well. But this is a really tricky space because technology is obviously global, international, and it's easy for tech-savvy people to get around those geographical boundaries with, you know, VPNs and so on. So I think it's an evolving territory which is really hard to manage.
Educating and speaking to children, young people, people who use these platforms, that not everything you see on this site is, you know, like having those conversations. Because, for example, why is it on TikTok that I could put up a video in activewear and have that taken down, but Andrew Tate content lives rent-free on that platform for so long? And I think it's educating people, and when you've got young, impressionable people, being aware of what they're consuming, because these platforms are not always, I think, representing the right kind of ideas, and also with what's going on in the political and social zeitgeist, especially with the influence of different kinds of political ideas, especially what's going on in America. Just be aware of what you're consuming, because I think it definitely shapes narratives.
Yeah, I think that's really important. The information's really important, but it's also, and this gets back to the sort of skills for bystanders, it's the skills of having the conversation too. How do you have a conversation with someone when you know you have information that they don't, and how do you sort of share that information in a sort of safe way with each other that's influential and useful? So I think there's a lot of skills we need to kind of help people build, not just informing them about stuff.
So off the back of this big conversation around technology and how abuse is evolving depending on the platforms, I want to ask each of you a question, and if you can, tell me the heart of it. I know it's a big ask because this is a big topic, but Tarang, I'll go with you first. What role do healthy masculinity programs play in shifting culture, especially when so much harmful messaging happens online now?
A lot of young men are shifting away from people like Andrew Tate, right? They think they don't think highly of him as an individual. The concerning part is that the damage is done. They're still holding views that are sexist or misogynistic or demeaning towards women. And so what I want to say about that is that healthy masculinity is such an important consideration when it comes to young men and boys, and understanding not only what will help keep the women in their lives safe, but will ultimately benefit them for the long term. And secondly, I think that what is so important to recognize is that we need boys to care about this, not because it's their sisters or their mothers or their cousins or their friends. It's because she's someone. It doesn't matter if she was a sex worker or whatever. We shouldn't be making moral judgments about victims of men's violence. Instead, we need to interrogate the conditions that allow for men's entitlement. And for me, the message to all boys and men is to sit in that discomfort, to actually interrogate it in yourself, that why do I have a need to say not all men are violent when we talk about violence? Why am I so reluctant to seek help for my own mental health issues? Why am I so afraid of calling out the behaviour of boys in the group chat when they send a text that I know doesn't sit right with my values? And so I think healthy masculinity is really about masculinities and expanding the possibilities for boys and men to flourish. Because ultimately, this isn't a zero-sum game. And what will benefit the women and gender diverse folk around the world will ultimately have really great positive consequences for boys and men as well.
And so then, Connor, if we're thinking about innovation and the future, what new approaches do you feel we need to better support children and young people as victim survivors, especially as technology-based abuse becomes more prevalent?
I think what I hear from children and young people in my work is the importance of relationship. You know, it was that worker, it was that adult, it was that person, it was that friend that lent in, took time to build trust and believed me. So I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the social media ban that's looming for young people, because I know also that a lot of children and young people help seek through social media.
Yeah.
So I think we need to make sure that we're building supports that children and young people can relate to, that recognise their unique individual experiences of family violence and that are there when they need them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because right now we don't have those supports available for children and young people. And also too, I often hear adults say that we need to give children and young people a voice. Children and young people already have voices. We need to lean in and listen to their voices and their expressions. So I think I'd challenge viewers to think about how they can not give children and young people voice, but listen to their voice
Listen.
and act with, not for them.
That's how they connect with people, and it's so how are you supplementing that?
Yep.
And it comes back to that conversation, I think, around resources.
For sure.
It's really important. And Heather, this is really important, and I really love that we're asking this here, because in this country, I don't think a lot of people would know that we actually have state-by-state protection orders, but that actually creates real gaps in safety. And so what do we need to do to shift to a consistent national framework? Because women and children's right to be safe shouldn't depend on where they live.
Look, protection orders are different in every state and territory, and the definition of family violence that underpins those orders is different in each state and territory. And we know that women and their children do flee across state borders regularly, or move across state borders in Australia often. So why should they have different levels of protection in different states and territories? So I think it's really important that we have a holistic approach to protection orders. We have over 100,000 applications made every year. So it's the most common legal intervention that women experiencing violence seek, most common intervention for them.
You know, when you were speaking about this change, and I guess we're talking about resources, we're talking about all of this, I know it can feel heavy, but if I can leave the people at home watching with one sentiment, if you ever feel like change is too big and it's difficult, I just want to call to example the work of another friend of mine, Chanel Contos. This is somebody who had a phone and an internet connection and just put up a poll and indulged that curiosity and that ability to speak and open conversation. And she did this around the experience of sexual violence and consent violations. She started that with a phone, an internet connection, and an Instagram story. And because of how many people spoke up, consent education has been changed in this country. The change that has literally happened on a cultural, federal level because one person decided to speak up and it gave power to so many others. That is your example that even when it feels like this stuff is so heavy and huge and impossible, it's not. It starts with one of us. And so on that note, I just want to thank our incredible panelists for your impactful, your powerful, your personal insights, because there's heart in what you're doing. It's not just you're giving of yourselves. So I thank you for that. I think what's clear is that ending violence against women and children, it's going to take action at every level, from legal systems to education to conversations at the dinner table. And it's things like challenging harmful masculinity, it's legal reform, it's empowering young people and children. UN Women Australia do work to not only champion advocacy in Australia, but they support global efforts as well. And so the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, last year alone, worldwide, it reached 7.7 million women and girls. Like, that is incredible. If you are somebody who wants to show your support, we really encourage you to please consider getting a part of the Safe Everywhere Always Challenge, because like we said, this is an ecosystem that takes all of us, and women and children deserve to be safe everywhere, always. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you for this conversation, and thank you for being a part of this movement.